The dog hit the door before it finished opening. Not the man on the stretcher, not the two medics bracing the gurney through the narrow corridor. The dog, a Belgian Malinois with a muzzle the color of charcoal and eyes that didn't blink, cleared the threshold first, then planted himself directly in the path of anyone who might try to get close. Nurse Petra Danworth saw it happen from the station at the end of the hall. She saw the dog assess the corridor in under 2 seconds. She saw the senior orderly, a man named Croft, who had worked trauma intake for 11 years, step back without being told. She saw the 2 military escorts keep their distance, not because of any order, but because the dog's body language made the order unnecessary. She grabbed her chart and walked toward them anyway. "Ma'am." One of the escorts, young, jaw tight, the kind of tense that came from 3 days without proper sleep, stepped slightly sideways, not blocking her, just makes himself visible. "He doesn't let people approach." "I noticed," Petra said. The escort looked briefly uncertain, like the question hadn't been in any briefing. "Flint." She stopped about 4 feet from the stretcher and crouched down so she wasn't looming. Flint watched her. His ears were forward, not flat. That mattered. "Hey, Flint," she said quietly. Just that. Not a command, not a lure. Just his name, the way you'd say it to someone you'd met before and were glad to see again. The dog's ears shifted. Not toward her, exactly. More like he was deciding whether to file her under threat or not yet determined. She didn't push it. She stood, looked at the man on the stretcher, and did her job. His name, she would learn later, was Sergeant Cole Whitfield, Canadian Special Operations Forces, and he had been airlifted from a location that nobody in this building was going to be told about. He had a gunshot wound through the right shoulder, a second through his side that had nicked something it shouldn't have, a hairline fracture in his left wrist, and a concussion severe enough that he kept trying to tell her. His name was Renault, which was not his name. He was 34 years old, and he looked like someone had been using him to test the load-bearing limits of the human body for the past decade. Flint did not leave the side of the stretcher. Not when they moved Whitfield to a room. Not when the surgeons assessed him. Not when the lights went down and the corridor outside quieted to its nighttime register of distant monitors and the occasional soft shoe of a nurse making rounds. The dog sat by the bed and watched the door. Petra's shift ran until 7 in the morning. She had 3 other patients on this floor. A post-operative recovery, a man with a respiratory infection that wasn't responding the way it should, and an elderly woman named Mrs. Teal who rang her call bell at approximately 2-hour intervals to ask for a glass of water and then spend 15 minutes talking about her late husband who had been a merchant marine. Petra didn't mind. Mrs. Teal's husband had died 4 years ago, and grief at that age didn't follow any schedule. She checked on Whitfield every 40 minutes, each time Flint watched her enter. Each time she crouched briefly and said his name before she approached the bed, and each time the dog held his position but didn't escalate. On her 4th check, she noticed something she hadn't before. Flint was not just watching her. He was watching her left forearm. She became aware of it the way you become aware of a sound you hadn't consciously registered, all at once, and then retroactively. She glanced down. Her sleeve had ridden up past her wrist. The tattoo on her inner forearm was visible, a small anchor, plain and unadorned, about the size of a silver dollar, with a horizontal line through the shank that made it look less decorative and more like a technical diagram. Flint's posture changed. It was subtle, the kind of change that would mean nothing to someone who didn't know dogs. But his weight shifted fractionally forward. His ears dropped 2 degrees from their forward alert position. Something in the line of his jaw softened. Petra looked at the tattoo, then at the dog. She had gotten the tattoo when she was 23, in a shop in Petawawa, 2 weeks after her brother's unit had shipped out on a rotation she wasn't supposed to know the details of. It wasn't sentimental, exactly. It was more like an anchor in the literal sense. Something to fix herself to when the worry got too abstract to manage. She'd never thought of it as anything that would mean something to a military working dog. But Flint had stopped looking at her face. He was looking at her arm. She held it out very slowly, knuckles down, not toward him, just visible, just present. He leaned forward and pressed his nose against the ink, once, carefully, and then sat back. He didn't move away from the bed, but he stopped tracking her the way he'd been tracking everyone else. The morning brought a man named Agent Briot. He arrived at 0630 in civilian clothes that didn't entirely hide what he was. Something about the way he held his identification when he showed it, economical and automatic, like the movement had been practiced past the point of self-consciousness. He introduced himself to the charge nurse at the station and asked about access to Whitfield's room. Petra was finishing her chart notes when she heard the conversation. She didn't look up. She heard Briot ask about the dog. She heard the charge nurse say that the dog had been cleared to remain, per the unit's standing request, and that he'd been assessed by the floor veterinary liaison that morning and was fine. She heard Briot ask who had been in contact with Whitfield overnight. She finished her notes, capped her pen, and went to find the floor supervisor before her shift ended. Dr. Osi was a compact, deliberate man who had been running this unit for 6 years and who did not waste words. He listened to what Petra said, that someone from what appeared to be a federal intelligence function was asking detailed questions about overnight access, and he nodded once. "Has anything been out of place?" he asked. She almost said no. Then she thought about it. "I found the door to the equipment room on this corridor propped up at 021, she said. "I closed it and assumed housekeeping. But housekeeping doesn't run at 021 fine on this floor." Osi's expression didn't shift, but his stillness changed quality. "I'll pass that on. I already logged it in the incident report." "Good." He paused. "Go home, Petra. Come back rested." She nodded. But she stood in the elevator for a moment after the doors closed, thinking about the equipment room, which was directly across the hall from Whitfield's room, and which had a ventilation panel that faced the same direction as his window. She came back that evening. She hadn't slept particularly well, which was not unusual. The apartment she rented in the East End was on the 3rd floor of a building that backed onto a rail corridor, and freight trains moved through at irregular hours. She had lived there for 2 years and still woke at the sound of them. She made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and thought about nothing in particular for a while. This was something she had learned from her brother, the tactical value of deliberate blankness. You couldn't think your way to clarity from inside a tangle. Sometimes you had to wait for things to settle. By 4 in the afternoon, she had made a decision she didn't entirely understand, changed into street clothes, and driven back to the hospital 40 minutes before her shift started. Flint heard her in the hallway. She could tell because when she pushed open the door, his head was already up and facing it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at her forearm. She had rolled up her sleeve. He lowered his head back to his paws. Whitfield was more lucid than he'd been the night before. He didn't try to tell her his name was Renaud. He watched her check his vitals with the kind of controlled patience that she recognized from her brother's friends. Men and women who were used to enduring things they couldn't control and had developed a particular quality of stillness in response. "The dog likes you," he said. His voice was rougher than she expected. "I think he's tolerating me," she said. "With Flint, those are the same thing." He looked at her arm. "Where'd you get that?" "Petawawa." Something moved behind his eyes. "You were based there?" "My brother was." She adjusted the IV line without looking up. "Rotation in 19. I went out to see him off." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. "Flint's handler," he said finally. "He was from Petawawa." She looked up. "Was," Whitfield said. She didn't ask the follow-up question. It wasn't the right moment, and she was starting to understand that with these kinds of men, the right moment was the only moment. She finished her check, made her notes, and moved toward the door. "Sergeant," she said, and he looked at her. "The equipment room across the hall. Who else knows you're on this floor?" His eyes sharpened. "Why?" "Someone propped that door open last night." The stillness that came over him was different from the patient stillness she'd seen before. This was operational, calibrated. "Get Briot," he said. She found Briot in the family consultation room on the 2nd floor, which he appeared to have temporarily converted into a workspace. He had a coffee and a laptop, and the particular flat affect of someone who had been awake for too long and had stopped performing otherwise. She told him about the equipment room. He didn't react the way she expected. He didn't pull out a notepad or ask follow-up questions immediately. He just looked at her for a moment, in a way that felt less like assessment and more like recalibration. "You logged it?" he said. "At 0277, you didn't mention it to anyone on shift this morning." Briot's expression didn't change. "Anyone else?" "No." He was quiet for a moment, then the report. Who has access to it? Every nurse and physician on rotation. The charge nurse. Administration, if they pull it. She paused. The same people who would have known Whitfield was being placed on that floor. He looked at her steadily. You're saying someone on this staff. I'm saying someone propped that door open at 021 Fev, and it wasn't housekeeping. He picked up his phone and made a call without explaining anything to her, which she didn't take personally. She left him to it. In the corridor, she stopped. There was a woman at the nursing station she hadn't seen before. That wasn't unusual in itself. The hospital ran multiple rotations, and she didn't know everyone. But something about the woman's posture was wrong. She was standing at the station the way someone stands when they're trying to look like they're waiting for something while actually watching something else. Petra went to the supply room at the far end of the hall and stood just inside the door and watched through the gap. The woman wasn't looking at the station. She was looking at the door to Whitfield's room. What happened next took approximately 6 minutes, which is a longer time than it sounds when you are watching it. Briot came out of the consultation room. He moved to the station. He said something to the charge nurse, very quietly. The woman's posture changed, just slightly, just enough. She walked toward the stairwell. Briot didn't follow her directly. He went to his phone. 2 minutes later, a security officer appeared at the stairwell door. Petra came out of the supply room and walked back to the station without hurrying. She picked up a chart she didn't need and stood there. The charge nurse looked at her. Do you know who that was? No, Petra said. She said she was from pharmacy, but she didn't have her ID on her badge clip. Petra looked down at the chart. Does pharmacy run this floor after hours? The charge nurse said nothing. Her expression said enough. The next 3 days were quiet in the way that things are quiet when something is being handled that you're not being told about. Briot came and went. 2 additional men arrived who were introduced as liaison staff and who did not behave like liaison staff. The floor felt different, not tense, exactly, but aware of itself. Whitfield got better, not quickly and not without setbacks. His fever spiked on the second night, and they lost 6 hours to managing that, and his shoulder required a second surgery that went 4 hours longer than planned. But on the third evening, when Petra came in for her check, he was sitting up and the quality of his attention had changed. He was tracking things, processing. Flint was still by the bed. You didn't have to come back early, Whitfield said. She hadn't known he knew about that. I had things to take care of, Brault told me. He looked at her. About the woman at the station, about what you flagged. She set down the chart. I didn't do anything. I just paid attention. That's what doing something looks like, most of the time. He was quiet for a moment. She worked in records. She'd been here for 18 months. Clean background, good references. He paused. They'd been running her for at least 6 of those months. Petra absorbed this. We're moving him the day after tomorrow, Briot said from the doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. Somewhere quieter, somewhere off the radar, Whitfield said, without any particular inflection. Same thing. Briot looked at Petra. You did good work. She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. The night before they moved him, she stayed late. Not officially, her shift ended at 7, but the building had a quiet at that hour that she liked, and she had a habit of finding reasons to stay inside it a little longer. She sat in the family lounge with tea she'd made from the electric kettle that lived on the counter beside the sink, and she looked out the window at the car park, which was almost empty, and the tree line beyond it, which was not. She heard the door open. Flint came in first. He walked to the chair across from her and lay down with his chin on his front paws and looked at her. Whitfield followed, moving slowly but under his own power, his arm in a sling, his ivy line capped and tucked. He lowered himself into the chair beside the dog with the careful economy of someone managing pain they'd decided not to mention. They sat for a while without talking. His handler's name was Corporal Jean-François Letourneau, Whitfield said eventually. We called him Toe. He'd been with Flint for 3 years. He looked down at the dog. He died 14 months ago. Flint's been reassigned twice since then. Neither handler worked out. Petra looked at the dog. Flint's eyes were half closed now. The anchor, she said slowly. Tot had one? On his left forearm. Same placement. He said his grandmother gave him the design. Whitfield paused. He was from Temiskaming, French-Canadian, Catholic, stubborn as anything. His grandmother had sailed across the Atlantic at 17 with nothing but a photograph of the town she was going to. He almost smiled. The anchor was hers first. Petra looked at her own arm. She thought about the shop in Petawawa. She thought about her brother, who had stood outside with her while she got it done and said nothing in particular, and been exactly the right kind of company. She thought about how you carry things you didn't know you were carrying until something notices them for you. "I don't believe in coincidences," Whitfield said. "I don't either," she said, "but I'm not sure what I believe in instead." He nodded, like that was a reasonable position. Toto would have said providence. I'm less certain about the theology. But something brought you into that hallway, and something made Flint stop. "He smelled the ink," she said. "Dogs remember scent longer than anything else." "Yes," Whitfield said. "That's probably it. He said it the way people say probably when they mean maybe, but." They sat for a little longer. Outside, the tree line held still against a sky that had gone the deep charcoal blue of late April in Ontario, and the car park was empty now, and the building was quiet, and the dog breathed slowly with his chin on his paws. "What happens to him?" Petra asked. "After you go, he comes with me," Whitfield said. "He's been cleared for extended assignment. Means he stays with the unit until they find him a permanent handler." He looked at Flint. "Could be a while. Is that hard on him?" Whitfield seemed to genuinely consider this. "He knows how to wait," he said finally, "better than most people I know." They left before her shift started the next morning. She came in to find the room clean and reset and a note on the station from Brio with a file reference number and a single line. "Your incident report has been integrated into a formal review. Thank you. No details. No follow-up." She folded the note and put it in her pocket and went to work. Mrs. Teal rang her call bell at 9:15 and again at 11:40. Both times Petra brought her water. Both times they talked about Gerald, the merchant marine, who had apparently once navigated a ship through a November storm in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, using nothing but dead reckoning and the memory of a coastline he'd learned as a boy. "He always said you don't need to see where you're going," Mrs. Teal said, wrapping her hands around the cup. "You just need to know what you're steering toward." Petra sat with her for a while after the water was finished. The room had a window that faced east, and the morning light was coming through it at a low angle that made everything look slightly golden, slightly temporary. She thought about Flint. She thought about a man named Tote who had carried a grandmother's anchor across an ocean he'd never sailed, on skin that was gone now, into a memory that a dog still held in the oldest part of his brain. She thought about her brother, who was somewhere she wasn't allowed to know, doing something she wasn't allowed to ask about, and who had stood outside a tattoo shop in Petawawa on a cold October afternoon and not said anything and been exactly enough. She rolled her sleeve down over her forearm and went back to work.